Dinner had barely begun when I felt it coming. My parents never held back their opinions, but tonight it was sharper, louder, and more pointed than usual. The plates hadn't even been cleared, and my father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, like he was about to announce the law of the universe. "Your brother," he said, voice heavy with pride. "He's responsible, reliable. You know, someone you can always count on." I froze mid-bite, a forkful of pasta hovering in the air. I had heard this line before, dozens of times. It never got easier. There was always that pause afterward, the one that screamed, "And you?" I knew exactly what was coming. My mother, ever the perfectionist, tilted her head slightly, lips pursed, giving that look she reserved for disappointment wrapped in superiority. "You drift through life," she said softly, almost sweetly, changing jobs, never sticking to anything long enough to really matter. "We just worry about you." The words landed like small stones, repeated over and over until they formed a wall around me. My brother, seated across the table, nodded along politely. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend me. He didn't need to. In their eyes, he was the golden child, the one who deserved admiration. And I was a cautionary tale. I remembered swallowing my anger, my frustration. Years of practice had taught me that speaking up during these dinner lectures only made things worse. The more I explained, the more my parents heard excuses. So I stayed quiet. I let them speak, let them build their own narrative of me being reckless, disorganized, unworthy. "What about his promotions?" my father continued. "And that car he just bought? Everything he does follows a plan. You should learn from him before it's too late." I nodded politely, careful not to reveal the tight knot of frustration forming in my chest. Inside, I was laughing quietly at the irony. They had no idea how close they were to being wrong about everything. They didn't know about the projects I'd handled in secret, the deals I'd closed without fanfare, the strategic exits I had orchestrated in jobs they had deemed failures. Confidentiality clauses didn't make for dinner conversation after all. My brother glanced at me, a hint of unease in his eyes. He must have felt the weight of their praise pressing down on me, but he said nothing. He always stayed within the lines, never wanting to upset the balance, never noticing how suffocating their comparisons were. After dinner, I washed the dishes quietly, listening to my parents recount my brother's achievements like a story they'd been telling for years. Promotions, awards, neat career paths. They repeated it all as if saying it aloud would make it truer. I didn't correct them. I let them believe the version of me they wanted. Aimless, unreliable, small. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number popped up, short and urgent. "Are you available for a meeting tomorrow morning?" Critical approvals needed. My heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of opportunity they'd never hear about over the dinner table. The kind that didn't come with flashy titles, applause, or family-friendly explanations. I sat on my bed for a moment, staring at the message, letting the silence of my apartment wrap around me. The house was quiet now, my parents gone to their own rooms, my brother probably replaying their words in his mind. He had no idea that while they were praising him, I was about to step into a world that demanded competence, precision, and discretion. The night passed slowly, the anticipation building. I reviewed my notes, double-checked schedules, and went over contingency plans. This meeting wasn't about ego or proving a point. It was about responsibility, something my parents believed I lacked. Irony had a sharp edge tonight, and I was holding it carefully in my hands. The next morning, I arrived early. The building was quiet, sleek, and unassuming. Nothing like the glass towers my parents imagined when they spoke of serious work. Inside, only a handful of people moved with purpose. Board members, senior partners, legal advisors, people who didn't need spectacle, only results. When the meeting began, there was no small talk, no ego display, just the cold, precise assessment of numbers, risks, and decisions. A division struggling under mismanagement, reports inflated, oversight missing, decisions that could have triggered investigations. And one of the names mentioned? My brother's company. The same one my parents had used as proof of his responsibility. I stayed silent at first, listening. Then I spoke, calm, clear, and unflustered. I laid out what I had found, the options available, the solutions necessary. Everyone listened. No one interrupted. No one argued. By the time I finished, the decisions were locked. Leadership would be replaced. Structures reorganized. Risks eliminated. I left the meeting feeling the quiet satisfaction of competence. Not victory, not revenge. Just truth. Later that evening, I watched my parents scroll social media, laughing over some trivial post about my brother's career milestones. They had no idea. They didn't know how close they were to seeing the narrative they had built crumble. They still thought of me as the drifting child, the one who needed guidance. And for the first time in a long while, I felt in control, not for their approval, but for myself. I woke early the next morning, heart steady but mind sharp. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that let you hear every thought bouncing around in your head. I dressed simply, no designer labels, no flashy colors, because in this world, competence didn't need a costume. What mattered was preparation, clarity, and control. The meeting location was discreet, tucked between two unremarkable office buildings. From the outside, it looked like any ordinary space, the kind my parents would dismiss as not important enough to build a career. Inside, it hummed with quiet efficiency. People moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable, their focus absolute. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on my shoulders. As I walked in, I greeted the senior partners and legal counsel with professional composure. They knew me. At least they knew the work I had done. That was enough. No introductions, no explanations about my personal life, no familial context needed. They trusted results, and I was here to deliver exactly that. The meeting began with reports. Numbers, deadlines, compliance gaps, project failures. One by one, issues were laid bare. And then came the part that tightened my chest for a moment. A subsidiary under my brother's management was flagged. A warning light flickered silently in my mind. My parents had spent years using his neat career as proof of reliability. Now, I was staring at evidence that all was not as polished as they had believed. I listened, observed, and calculated. When the floor was open, I spoke. My voice was calm, measured, firm, the tone of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. I walked them through audits, internal discrepancies, leadership gaps, and risks. I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize. Just the facts, clear and unavoidable. Every word I spoke carried weight. Every recommendation I made was backed with documentation, projections, and legal guidance. I laid out two options: quietly absorb and restructure, or risk the company's reputation by leaving leadership unchecked. No one questioned the logic. No one hesitated. Decisions were made, authority was reassigned, and responsibility was clarified, all without a single dramatic outburst. By the time the meeting ended, I felt a strange calm. Not victory, not vindication. Just the steady satisfaction of competence being recognized without anyone needing to shout. It was a quiet, invisible triumph, the kind that couldn't be tweeted about or posted on social media. Yet, I knew it mattered more than any applause my parents had ever given my brother at a family dinner. Walking back to my apartment, I felt a curious mix of relief and anticipation. My parents had no idea. They were still imagining me as the drifting child, incapable of commitment, needing guidance at every step. My brother would come home proud of the praise he had earned, unaware that the foundation beneath him had shifted quietly and irreversibly. That evening, my phone buzzed. My brother's name flashed on the screen. His message was hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Can we talk? I think I need some advice." I stared at it for a long moment, savoring the irony. He had always been the one who seemed untouchable in my parents' eyes, the golden child, the exemplar of responsibility. And now he was reaching out to me, He didn't know it yet, but the roles had begun to reverse. When he arrived unannounced, I noticed the small changes immediately. The confident posture, the assured smile, the way he carried himself gone. In their place, uncertainty, fatigue, and a quiet awareness that the world wasn't quite as predictable as he had imagined. We sat in my living room, cups of coffee between us, the air thick with unspoken tension. He asked questions carefully, almost cautiously, about the restructuring, the risks, and the decisions. I answered calmly, giving guidance without gloating, advice without condescension. This wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, fairness, and letting the truth speak for itself. For the first time, I realized how strange it felt to see my brother dependent, uncertain, looking to me for insight. All those family dinners, all those comparisons, seemed like a lifetime away. The power dynamic had shifted subtly, but unmistakably. I was no longer the unreliable one. I was competent, steady, and in control. Later that night, my parents called. Their voices were tense, fragile beneath the surface. They asked about my plans, about my brother, about how he could be helped. I listened quietly, carefully. I didn't offer them reassurance or excuses. I only stated what had already been decided. They were hearing the truth, but the truth wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The reality of competence is often quieter than the noise of judgment. By the end of the call, there was a long silence. They were processing, recalibrating, and for the first time, they couldn't rely on their narrative of me as the drifting daughter. That story had crumbled quietly, imperceptibly, and it was too late to rebuild it in the way they wanted. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need them to understand the full extent of what I had done. It was enough that the truth existed, and that it had already begun to change the way my family saw me. That night, I reflected on the years of being underestimated, dismissed, and compared to my brother. I realized that the quiet work, the unseen effort, the steady competence, those were the things that truly mattered. And finally, the scales were tipping in my favor, just as they should have been all along. The next morning, I woke to a quiet apartment, the kind of calm that feels heavier than noise. My brother had stayed late the night before, leaving without saying much. The subtle tension in his eyes lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave the room. It was strange seeing him that way. He had always been the confident, untouchable one, my parents' perfect child, the golden standard I could never measure up to. And now he was human. I made tea and sat by the window, thinking about how differently things had begun. The dinners, the comparisons, the constant reminders that I was less than my brother. They had shaped me, yes, but in a way I could never have predicted. Those words, though meant to belittle, had quietly fueled something in me. They had forced me to observe, to plan, to operate without fanfare, to move where others couldn't see. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a confirmation of the next round of professional reviews. Internal audits, follow-ups, and oversight approvals that had once seemed tedious, but were now tools of control. I smiled faintly. While my parents praised my brother's predictable success, I had built a foundation no one else noticed. It was quiet, deliberate, and powerful. Later, my brother called. His voice was careful, hesitant, carrying that subtle uncertainty I had rarely heard from him. I need advice, he said. About the company, the changes. How did you handle it so cleanly? I told him what I always told people in situations like this. Facts first, emotions later. No panic, no posturing. He listened a little too eagerly, hanging on to every word. There was no pride, no defensiveness, only the recognition that I knew more than he ever realized. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be quietly competent. And for the first time, he had to respect me, not as his sister, not as the child they constantly compared to him, but as someone who could handle responsibility with calm authority. By afternoon, the whispers began. Rumors of sudden leadership changes, of restructuring, of decisions that seemed too precise to be accidental. My parents, oblivious as ever, were still scrolling through my brother's achievements online, laughing at his perfect life, completely unaware that the foundation they praised had shifted. When he arrived at my apartment mid-afternoon, I noticed the difference immediately. No suit, no confident smile, no aura of invincibility. Just tired eyes, nervous gestures, and a cautious tone. "I never realized how much work you actually do," he admitted quietly. "I thought I had control. I thought I understood the game." I sipped my tea, keeping my expression neutral. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I simply explained the facts, the decisions, and the strategies I had implemented. He listened, nodding, taking in every detail as though he were learning a new language. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted so subtly it almost felt like a whisper in the room rather than a seismic change. That evening, my parents called again. Their voices carried tension I had never heard before. They asked about my brother, about the changes, about what could be done to help him. I gave them concise answers, letting them piece together the reality on their own. No lectures, no vindication. The truth, after all, was louder than any words I could have shouted. I realized something important as I hung up. My parents had spent years shaping a narrative that suited them. They painted my brother as flawless, me as lacking. But reality doesn't care about narratives. It unfolds quietly in meetings, decisions, and actions that go unseen at the dinner table. Over the next few days, the pattern became clear. My brother was learning, hesitantly, what it meant to rely on someone else, to navigate a system he had thought he controlled. My parents, meanwhile, were beginning to notice the cracks, not openly, not dramatically, but in subtle questions, half-statements, the small way they began to consult me indirectly, as if afraid of my reaction. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't about revenge. It was about validation. It was about watching the truth settle where it belonged, about seeing the discrepancy between perception and reality finally corrected. I didn't need applause or public recognition. I needed the story they had been telling themselves about me to falter, and it was faltering, quietly but unmistakably. That weekend, my brother came by again. This time, the conversation was different. No longer tentative, no longer afraid to admit gaps in his understanding. He asked questions that revealed humility, a willingness to learn from someone he had once unconsciously dismissed. And I responded with patience, clarity, and guidance, without judgment. I was no longer the sister in the shadow. I was a professional, an equal, someone whose competence could not be ignored. That evening, I finally understood the full irony of our family dynamic. My parents had believed that success was measurable by titles, neat promotions, and visible achievements. They had dismissed my efforts because they were quiet, discreet, and uncelebrated. Yet, here I was, orchestrating outcomes that affected more than just my immediate circle, quietly proving my worth in a world that didn't need applause to recognize it. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of empowerment that wasn't contingent on their approval. The comparisons, the judgment, the endless weighing of me against my brother, all of it was no longer relevant. I had finally taken control of my narrative, and while my parents still saw what they wanted to see, the reality was far more complex and far more satisfying than they could imagine. By the middle of the week, the subtle shifts in our family dynamic were impossible to ignore. My parents, once so confident in their narrative, were now treading carefully. I noticed it in the phone calls, measured questions, indirect references, a hesitancy in their tone that had never been there before. The golden child, my brother, was no longer untouchable. And I was quietly standing at the center of it all. It started with small things. My father asked about my schedule, casually, almost as if he were gauging how much control I actually had over my life. My mother began mentioning decisions at work, not mine directly, but in passing, almost hoping I'd correct her if she misunderstood. They were curious, cautious, testing the waters, and I let them. There was no rush to prove anything. The truth, after all, has a way of making its presence known without theatrics. Then came the moment I had been anticipating, an invitation that would force their perception to meet reality. A private dinner, high-profile guests, the the kind of event they had always dreamed of attending but never received an invitation. Only this time, the invitation was in my name. Their names were included as guests, but the emphasis was clear. I was the one recognized, the one trusted, the one controlling the connection. I remember watching my parents' reactions when they saw the invitation. My mother's hand froze over her coffee cup, her eyes flicking back and forth between the envelope and me. My father leaned back, eyebrows raised, suddenly uncertain of what he was witnessing. Their expressions were priceless, part confusion, part disbelief, part reluctant acknowledgement. The dinner itself was calm, measured, almost ordinary in its surface interactions. Names were exchanged carefully, titles mentioned casually, the kind of networking that had power beneath the polite chatter. And there I was at the center of it, explaining, advising, and facilitating in ways that commanded attention without demanding it. The hosts listened to me with respect. Colleagues deferred subtly, taking cues from my calm authority. I didn't have to boast. My presence, my knowledge, my poise said it all. Across the table, I caught sight of my parents. Their smiles were polite but stiff, their eyes betraying the internal calculation of what was happening. My mother glanced at me, almost searching for a misstep. There wasn't one. I moved, spoke, and guided the evening with precision, proving in real time that their narrative of me as unreliable was fundamentally wrong. After the dinner, the drive home was quiet. My father broke the silence first, cautiously. "So, tell me exactly what you do," he said. No judgment, no accusation, just curiosity, tinged with the realization that the story they had told themselves might not match reality. I told him, calmly, factually, and without embellishment. I outlined my responsibilities, the scope of my decisions, the impact of my work, the authority I exercised. I didn't inflate anything. There was no need. The truth was sufficient, undeniable, and quietly impressive. For the first time, my father didn't look disappointed. He looked small, not in a humiliating way, but in the way someone feels when they realize they've underestimated someone they were supposed to understand. My mother's eyes glistened, not with pride, but with the grief of recognizing how wrong she had been in labeling me for years. She mourned the narrative she had held onto so tightly, the story that had placed my brother above me in every conceivable way. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The satisfaction was quiet, deep, and entirely internal. The validation I had spent years waiting for wasn't coming from their words. It was already there, built through competence, preparation, and quiet excellence. The next day, my brother called. His voice was cautious, respectful, and for the first time, slightly humbled. "I finally understand," he said. "I didn't realize how much you've done, how much you've carried, quietly, without anyone noticing." He didn't apologize. He didn't try to claim authority back. He simply recognized, and that acknowledgement mattered more than any congratulations. Over the following week, subtle changes continued. My parents were more careful, measured, polite in interactions, unsure of how to address the daughter they had long considered lost or directionless. My brother treated me with new respect, not because I had overtly proven superiority, but because my actions spoke louder than any family argument ever could. I reflected on all those dinners, all the comparisons, all the moments of quiet dismissal. The irony was sharp but satisfying. The people who had judged me most harshly had no idea how deeply competent I truly was. They had measured me by visible, conventional markers, while my real influence had always operated quietly, efficiently, and behind the scenes. I stopped waiting for approval. The respect had emerged naturally, organically, from the reality of my actions. And while my parents still occasionally brought up my brother's achievements, their tone had shifted. No longer did they compare. No longer did they assert my failures. They had begun, finally, to see me as something more complex, something undeniable, something true. By the end of the week, I understood that the story had changed. The golden child narrative had cracked. My parents' perception had shifted, slowly but unmistakably. and I had done it without anger, without drama, and without ever needing to raise my voice. The truth, quiet and persistent, had finally spoken for itself. The days after the private dinner were unlike anything I had experienced with my family before. There was an unspoken tension, the kind that fills a room without a single word. My parents had begun to treat me differently, careful, polite, even deferential in subtle ways. I could see it in the way they phrased questions, the pauses before they spoke, the way they watched me process information as though unsure of what to expect. It wasn't pride, not yet. Not acknowledgement in the form they had given my brother so freely. No, it was something quieter, deeper, recalibration. They were seeing the daughter they had dismissed for years in a new light, one that didn't fit their old narratives. And they didn't quite know how to respond. My brother was the first to confront the reality fully. He came by one afternoon, visibly shaken. The confident demeanor he carried to family dinners was gone. He moved carefully, almost hesitantly, as if stepping into territory he had never explored before. Vulnerability. I need to understand how you do it, he admitted. How you manage so much without anyone noticing, without needing approval. I never realized. I listened quietly. I didn't chastise him. I didn't point out the years of ignorance or comparisons. Instead, I laid out what I had done, step by step, focusing on the facts, the decisions, the planning, and the discipline. He nodded, taking in every word. And for the first time, I felt him truly respect me, not as his sister, not as the drifting child, but as someone whose competence and authority were unquestionable. Meanwhile, my parents began to reach out in small, careful ways. My mother would ask for advice on minor decisions, phrasing it as a suggestion rather than instruction. My father would mention a problem at work or in the neighborhood, waiting for my input before taking action. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but to me it was everything. Their casual confidence in my abilities had shifted, and it wasn't because I demanded it, it was because the truth of my competence was undeniable. The irony was not lost on me. For years, they had equated success with visible achievements. Neat promotions, awards, material proof that someone was responsible. They had praised my brother endlessly for his perfect life, while dismissing my efforts as aimless or inadequate. Yet here I was orchestrating outcomes, managing complex decisions, and influencing results that mattered, all quietly behind the scenes. The validation I had longed for silently came from the recognition of my skill, not their applause. My brother began to adjust as well. He asked questions, sought guidance, and gradually began to rely on my advice for professional decisions he had previously considered trivial or beneath him. Our roles were no longer defined by parental comparison. He had to acknowledge my expertise, and I offered it without judgment, without condescension. It was a strange, delicate balance of power shifting, but it was real and inevitable. One evening, my parents asked to have dinner together at my place. I agreed, curious to see how they would navigate the new dynamic. The dinner started awkwardly, with forced conversation and careful manners. My mother commented on a recent project I had completed, her tone polite but restrained. My father asked about my schedule, phrasing it as a request for insight rather than judgment. I realized, as I listened to their cautious words, that something profound had happened. They were no longer speaking from certainty. They were observing, recalculating, trying to understand the daughter they had long underestimated. They were confronting the reality that the narrative they had built around my brother's perfection and my inadequacy was incomplete, flawed, and in some ways irrelevant. By the end of the meal, the tension had softened but not disappeared. My parents were polite, careful, and respectful, but they still struggled to integrate the truth fully into their worldview. They had always wanted me to follow a path visible to the world, one that could be measured and praised. Now they were seeing the power of quiet, deliberate competence, and it unsettled them in ways I had anticipated but could not have predicted fully. I didn't seek their approval. I didn't expect them to celebrate me or my achievements the way they had celebrated my brother. I had learned long ago that validation is fleeting when it comes from others. It's only lasting when it comes from oneself. And for the first time, I felt entirely validated, not through applause or praise, but through recognition, subtle and undeniable, that the daughter they dismissed was capable, authoritative, and steady. My brother texted me later that week. "I think I understand now. You've always had it figured out." No apology, no admission of past arrogance, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. He didn't need to praise me. He didn't need to compete with me anymore. The truth had shifted the balance, quietly but permanently. And my parents, they were learning too, slowly. Their interactions with me had changed, measured, polite, careful. They weren't warm, they weren't effusive, but they had begun to see me as someone who mattered, someone whose competence couldn't be dismissed, and someone whose presence could not be ignored. It was subtle, slow, and quiet, but it was complete. By the time the following week arrived, life had settled into a new rhythm, one that my parents, my brother, and I were all still learning to navigate. The invisible hierarchy that had defined our family for so long had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. My parents were no longer speaking from certainty. My brother was no longer untouchable, and I was no longer the drifting child they had so often described. It was a strange relief. I didn't expect praise or adoration. I didn't want dramatic apologies. I wanted something far more lasting. Recognition of my value, acknowledgement that the quiet, steady work I had carried out for years was not only meaningful but indispensable. And finally I had it. My parents began to speak differently to me. Their tone was cautious, deliberate, almost reverent in moments of decision. My father would ask for my input first, considering my opinions seriously before offering his own. My mother still struggled with fully letting go of old narratives, but she asked questions with genuine curiosity instead of judgment. The subtle difference was everything. It wasn't warmth or celebration. They weren't suddenly doting or indulgent, but it was respect, and that was what mattered. My brother, meanwhile, had shifted in ways that were less visible but far more profound. He called more often, asking questions about professional decisions, seeking advice on situations he might once have dismissed. He no longer assumed that competence was tied solely to appearances, promotions, or awards. He was learning humility, recognition, and the quiet strength of someone who could carry responsibility without needing recognition. One evening, my parents came over unexpectedly. I had prepared dinner, though without fanfare. As we sat down together, I noticed the careful attention in their voices, the subtle pauses that indicated they were measuring their words. "We've been thinking," my father said slowly, "about how we've misjudged things." My mother nodded, eyes glistening faintly. There was no dramatics, no tears of joy, just the quiet acknowledgement I had longed for. I smiled softly and said nothing. The recognition wasn't mine to demand. It had arrived naturally, through years of steady work and deliberate competence. I let them feel the weight of the truth without commentary, letting their recalibration unfold at its own pace. Over the next few weeks, interactions became smoother. My parents began consulting me on decisions large and small, from investments to household matters, seeking insight rather than issuing judgment. My brother had settled into a new rhythm as well, learning from the subtle lessons I had offered, gaining confidence not through blind certainty, but through careful understanding. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were still moments of old habits, reminders of the narratives they had clung to for years. But those moments no longer defined me. They no longer dictated my sense of self-worth. I had claimed my space, quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably. Reflecting on it all, I realized something profound. The power of truth isn't loud. It doesn't need drama or confrontation. It exists in consistency, competence, and calm authority. My parents had assumed I would need validation, rescue, or guidance. My brother had assumed that his path was untouchable. And yet, through quiet diligence and careful action, I had shifted everything without anyone needing to shout. Sometimes, when I think back to those early dinners, to the comparisons, the judgment, the subtle dismissals, I can almost laugh. The people who had measured my life by visible markers of success had no idea that true influence had been quietly in my hands all along. And when the moment came, when it mattered most, the truth spoke. My parents never fully admitted they had been wrong in the words they had once spoken so casually at the dinner table. They didn't need to. Their careful deference, their measured acknowledgement, and the subtle changes in their behavior said it all. And my brother? He never mocked, never minimized, never tried to reclaim an assumed superiority. He simply adjusted, respected, and learned. That, I realized, was enough. I stopped worrying about their narrative, their assumptions, and their expectations. My life, my competence, my quiet authority, those were mine, and they were undeniable. The comparisons, the judgments, the labels, they had all been dismantled, not with drama, but with results. And the best part, I didn't have to force recognition. I didn't have to demand applause. The truth had arrived, quietly, steadily, irrevocably. Sitting in my apartment one evening, I looked around the life I had built, steady, disciplined, and meaningful in ways no one at that dinner table could fully grasp. My parents, my brother. Even I had learned something important. That success isn't always visible. That competence doesn't need constant validation. And that the quiet, steady work we carry out, the choices we make without seeking attention, can reshape perceptions, relationships, and even family dynamics without a single word of boasting. I smiled to myself. For the first time, I felt entirely free of the comparisons, entirely certain of my worth, and entirely at peace. My parents had seen enough to respect me. My brother had learned enough to grow, and I had done it all quietly, deliberately, with competence as my witness. The golden child narrative had crumbled. The labels of inadequacy had been quietly erased. And in the calm aftermath, I realized that the truth, steady, persistent, undeniable, was the most satisfying victory of all.